Welcome to In Focus with Imtiaz. Let's begin this evening with two multilateral diplomatic offensives against China led by the United States. The first came with the G7 summit statement, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan Strait investigations into the origins of COVID-19. Then on Monday, the 30-member NATO issued another statement that mentions China 10 times and whose paragraphs 55 and 56 were all about China's stated ambitions and assertive behavior that present systemic challenges to the rules-based international order and to areas relevant to alliance security, unquote. This is actually a quote from paragraph 56 of the NATO statement. China has, of course, pushed back, accusing G7 of political manipulation by making baseless allegations. Stop slandering China, stop interfering in China's internal affairs, and stop harming China's interests, a spokesman at the Chinese embassy in London was quoted as saying. The US President Joe Biden seems to be pushing what he had said about China during campaigning and since he has assumed office. The US will work with its allies to contain China's rising power. In essence, as Noam Chomsky has also pointed out in a recent interview, Biden's foreign policy is largely indistinguishable from Trump's, at least to the extent of China, where China is concerned. So let's dive right into it. I'm joined by Dr. Najam, inaugural dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Dr. Najam has previously served as vice chancellor of the Lahore University of Management Sciences. David Sedney. David is a senior associate and non-resident with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia and thereafter as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. I also have with me Einar, a political and economic affairs commentator based in Beijing. So it's a great panel with me this evening. But before I get to my experts, a couple of things. It's interesting, I talked about Noam Chomsky's interview, and in that, he talked about, and I quote from what he said, if we look at history, we find regular echoes of Senator Arthur Vandenberg's 1947 advice to the president that he should scare hell out of the American people if he wanted to whip them up to a frenzy of fear over the Russian threat to take over the world. So now, seemingly, the threat has moved from Russia to China. And Professor Chomsky also says that while China does confront US power in the South China Sea, not the Atlantic or Pacific. And he goes on to say it is, and he gives other reasons also, and then goes on to say it is rather odd to regard all of this as a challenge to US hegemony. As far as the NATO statement is concerned, it talks about China's, rapid expansion and says China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal with more warheads and a large number of sophisticated delivery systems to establish a nuclear triad. Well, I don't think that's news, but it goes on to say it's opaque in implementing its military modernization, and it's publicly declared civil-military fusion strategy. Which I find very interesting, and that's something I'm going to take to David Sedney, because I don't think that there's any state, of course, including the United States, that would not keep a lot of what it does in the military sphere opaque. There are certain things that are transparent, but a lot of it is opaque. So, David Sedney, how do you look at this? I mean, is this a surprise that China is a triad? Is this a surprise that China, obviously, as a rising power, is going to compete with the United States in certain respects? While, of course, trading with the United States, while, of course, trying to find points of convergence. Is it somewhat self-fulfilling prophecy that the United States should focus really on the areas of divergence rather than on the points of convergence?
Not at all. I have to say that I, along with most people, would dismiss Mr. Chomsky as a sort of irrelevant commentator. And there are many other more respected, more mainstream commentators that I would quote. But the big issue for China is the fact, as the statement you mentioned put out is China has now decided that it wants to pose a systemic challenge to a rules-based international order. That's the problem with China. A rising state, China, the U.S. has supported the rise of China. The U.S. Trade with China has been one of the major engines for Chinese growth. And for many years, the United States harbored the thinking that China would become a partner in the international arena. But over the last decade, really, certainly since the ascension of Xi Jinping, China has exhibited a much different attitude towards the rest of the world. You quoted the Chinese embassy in London. The Chinese ambassador there, Liu Xiaoming, is one of the exponents of China's so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, where they lash out in very strong terms against anyone they consider to have even minutely criticized China. This statement that you cited earlier is another example of this kind of wolf warrior diplomacy. China has started swinging its weight around in really disturbing ways. I'll point particularly to Australia, where China has tried to use its economic might, its economic muscle to intimidate Australia to accepting a wide range of limits on political free speech in Australia, things that are fundamental to the Australian political order. The same thing in the United States. Chinese efforts to muzzle a wide range of critics of China, either directly or indirectly through use of cyber means, is something that has really brought into highlight that concern, that systemic challenge. At the same time, I wouldn't exaggerate it, Einar. The NATO statement speaks of Russia as a threat and uses the word challenge to describe China. Both the prime ministers of Germany and the UK were somewhat more measured in their critique of China. So there's still a long way to go. But the big issue here is China's behavior. If China wants confrontation, it will get it. And so far, it looks as if China is saying it wants confrontation. And if it wants it, it's going to get it.
Right. Dr. Adil Najam, every time we hear about the rules-based order, we realize that, not many questions are being asked about whose rules and whose order. Now, post-World War II, we know that this order was established by the victorious powers, led by the United States. And so they have essentially locked the global security architecture. I mean, it is something that redounds to their advantage. And obviously, a challenge to this is something that they would not like. Having said that, Chinese on more than one occasion have actually staked a claim to this, saying, well, we are a global actor and we want to be part of this. And there are parts of this global security architecture that we accept, and there are others that we do not accept. So it's not like Beijing is saying that we want to be the outliers. So give me your sense of, quite apart from David Sedney's comment about Professor Chomsky, we'll set that aside. Give me your sense of the G7 statement and also the statement from NATO.
So I think you are exactly right. The question really is not whether China wants to play by the rules or not. The question really is whose rules and whose order, as you point out. In fact, the change in China over the last decade is that they very clearly want to be the rule makers, either with or without. And that, in many ways, this order that had come out of the Second World War, the G7 came later, but the Security Council and so on and so forth, of which China is a part. So this is really a question of whose rule and whose order in the most fundamental sense. China, in fact, likes rules. China just likes its own rules and has more rules than everyone else combined. The story here is not just about China. The story here is also about the US. The story is not just of the rise of China. The story is also of the challenges, if not the fall. I don't think there's a fall, but certainly the challenges within the US and globally that the US has. And the story is really about a reformulating world order. That in fact, that little hiatus, and it really was very little, of a seeming unilateralism after the fall of the Soviet Union, that is what is being restructured. And in many ways, there is really no surprise here. There's no surprise in China's behavior. There's no surprise in the US behavior. The surprise is simply in the speed that I think was triggered by Mr. Trump and by COVID, that in some ways the Obama years, and whether it was a doctrine or not, of trying to move ahead with China fell apart more quickly than one would have imagined when Mr. Trump came and Mr. Biden has put the foot on the accelerator. The story here is also about the increasing irrelevance of those systems of rule-based. So, what was on display this week was the utter irrelevance of the G77 and sometimes the ridiculousness of that. It was best exemplified by that picture of the British Queen trying to cut a cake with the wrong side of the sword. But it was on display again and again, and for the rest of the world that is not China and the world that is not the US, G7 has become an increasingly less relevant player, and in some ways, China or China, the attack on China from there and NATO is also a gasp for a new relevance to these groups that in many ways had in fact emerged as groups of opposition to something rather than groups of global economic order or any other form of rule-based.
Right. So I'm letting Einar Tangen, listen in before I get to him. But very quickly, Adil, frankly, when you say there's nothing surprising about how Beijing is behaving or Washington, D.C., that makes the structural realist in me very happy. I'll be very honest. And I make this point because I know that you don't find structural realism a very good sort of benchmark. But nonetheless, very quickly, David Sedney's reference to Chinese sanctions against Australia. Now, the interesting thing is that the kind of global finance system that we have created, that the United States has created, makes the US very powerful by the very force of sanctions. So the United States can actually throw you out of the global financial system. The US created a Monroe Doctrine at a time when even the US Navy was not strong enough to actually enforce it. And Beijing is essentially doing the same thing in its backyard with reference to Australia. I mean, I wrote something like 4 or 5 months ago in which I said this is like a test case, the way Beijing is dealing with Canberra. So the thing is that there is a sort of, assertion under Xi Jinping, unlike Deng Xiaoping, which wanted to stay below the radar. There's a certain assertion that we have arrived. And do you think, is that something that's actually creating the tension between the United States and China?
I'm a realist. I think that, as you say, was there and had to be there. When you have a great power that is rising, you have a great power that is even if not falling, and I don't think it is falling, will see that as a threat. Will see that as a threat and will do something to try to contain the threat. I think what you call the backyard, let us use another terminology that we've been familiar with before, because that is what I think this is about. This is about spheres of influence. In some ways, this is China's reaction and the US reaction. If you think, let me bring the other institution emerging here into the picture, the Quad. Right. And so if you think about the type of statements you are hearing now, but you also think about the rise of the Quad, and where is the Quad? It is Australia, it is India, it is Japan. In some ways, this is the sort of two peacocks of the world saying, this is my sphere of influence. This is my hemisphere, if you will. And in some ways, this is the US reasserting this is my world, and this is China kind of saying, well, not all of it, and not to the extent that it would be. And again, for those two powers, that is what you would expect. I think what I worry about is the rest of the world. The only last sort of one short point, I think inevitable it is, as I do think it is, the timing is important. I think the only thing, the one thing that changed dramatically with Mr. Trump's sort of persona was that something that the US as well as China seemed to want to delay was put on the front burner. It's not as if China came out. It was in some ways that China was forced out. Maybe that was strategic on the part of the US, that why give China the time to grow further militarily and otherwise. If there is going to be a confrontation, let's bring it now, because China would have probably preferred all of this rhetoric to come, 10, 15, 20 years from now, when it's even more strong, so that there are less levers on it. And I think between COVID and Mr. Trump, the timeline of this that seemed to be moving towards in Mr. Obama's time was put on acceleration. And what G7 meeting and this NATO meeting says to me is not that China has come out, but also that the US has now come out.
Okay.
In some ways acknowledged that that China is now an equal rival, that it is not an emerging power, it is the power that the US and the so-called West will now confront.
Right. So at this point, let's in Einar Tangen. Einar, you heard what David Sedney said. You also heard what Adil Najam said. So the floor is yours. We can then get to specifics, but give me your impression of how you look at this.
I'm going to keep this fairly short. What you have is an older power established, clinging to a world order, which is not run very well. I mean, if you ask the world how things are going in the Middle East, how things are going in Afghanistan, I think if you ask people in your own country, Pakistan, how things have kind of worked out on the U.S., it has been good. Now, in terms of China, the expectation was that China would change. It was about regime change. WTO was not about, magnanimously lending a hand to a foreign country. U.S., we don't really do that. We like to keep countries underneath us. We believe in Pax Americana, and therefore American exceptionalism, that we do what is necessary to bring the world under an order that we believe in. So at this point, China is guilty of success. It can't hide the way it used to under Deng Xiaoping, because under Deng Xiaoping, China had nothing. Today, it is a very large power. Now, what is happening from China's perspective is they see a very aggressive U.S. clinging to a world order that is fast slipping away from it. 400, if you have 400 bases surrounding you tend to get a little bit paranoid, especially when they could threaten to cut you off, at least on the seaside, from the resources that you need, and also the exports that you manufacture and pay for those imported goods, resources. So from China's perspective, they see this really as the U.S. Just kind of holding on to something. They're not quite certain how to handle it. There have been missteps. I don't think wolf warrior diplomacy has been very effective, but obviously there's tremendous frustrations on their side, because they don't really see themselves doing anything wrong, despite all the international press saying to the otherwise.
Okay, so I remember you and I have been talking about this on this program when President Trump was in power, and when he lost the election, there was a sense that, and you expressed that, as also some other Chinese experts, that probably with President Biden, even though it's going to be a sort of, a rival, sort of competitive kind of approach, but it'll be more nuanced. Now with this, do you still hold that view, or do you think that it's as brazen as under President Trump?
A lot of leeway that he would have taken a different approach. But this is domestic politics. Biden is saddled with a very thin margin that is not cooperating with him in terms of getting his domestic policies through. And as a result, he's had to kind of look forward to the traditionally midterms elections. Whoever has the White House, they get a drubbing. They lose a lot of votes. Generally, they lose the majority in at least one or both. So at this point, he's just trying to get something around where he can be powerful enough to push through his domestic agenda. China is just the bipartisan issue, the whipping boy that is there. I mean, you can blame China for everything. If the U.S. mishandled COVID-19, it's China's fault. If there's a huge deficit in the U.S., it's China's fault. So it's just one of those things. We've used it in the past. We have not been shy about blaming others, whether it's been the Native Americans or new immigrant groups or foreign powers in our quest to, always be on the right side of things and avoid a little bit of self-reflection about some of the assumptions that we make about the world.
Right. David said, how much of this, Einar has made this point before also, and he's made it again, with reference to domestic politics. How much of this is actually grounded in that?
It's not at all grounded in that, Ajaz. And first of all, it's important for your viewers to know that your other two guests work with and are employed in China. I cannot get a visa to go to China. People who speak accurately about what's going on in China can't go to China anymore. The restrictions on who can speak about China around the world is something that the Chinese work very hard. So it's important for your viewers to know they should actually discount what the people you're talking to, because their ability to speak freely is limited by the fact that they are subject to the control of the Chinese Communist Party just by being in China. In terms of China changing, China has changed immeasurably. I spent 7 years living in China, and I saw a lot of positive change. That stopped when Xi Jinping took power in 2012. It was not about President Trump changing, it was about China changing. That change from the emphasis of Deng Xiaoping on economic growth to a new, including military power and domination of others, began in 2012. It will continue for at least another 6 years because Xi Jinping will break the pattern that Deng Xiaoping set up of senior leaders retiring after 2 terms, and he will get at least a 3rd term and maybe a 4th term and become an even more authoritarian ruler of China. And the reason that NATO and the EU have taken these positions is because of what China has done. So China has changed, and the world is reacting to that change.
Okay, David, here's the thing. I've certainly got interested in your remark with reference to the other 2 guests. So are you implying that anyone who is not straight off the bat anti-China is someone who is somehow under the Chinese Communist Party's influence? That's one thing. Secondly, with reference to human rights, frankly, and this is without prejudice to what you said with reference to Xinjiang, the fact is that we very clearly see that the United States, in terms of its sort of neoliberal, rights-based approach, cherry picks. I mean, just down south from Xinjiang, there's a place called, which we call in Pakistan, and without any apologies for that, the Indian-occupied and illegally annexed Kashmir, where for the last 70 years, there's been a lot of repression, and certainly for the last 2 years, immense repression. We haven't heard anything from the United States on that. Very recently, there was the conflict between Palestinians. How can one call it a conflict? Because conflict happens between 2 symmetrical powers. But the Israeli repression. And the US administration was extremely reluctant to talk about that. So the point is that if one has to be consistent, then one should be consistent. On the other hand, one can say, yes, states have a double speak. And we are talking about Chinese repression in Xinjiang because China is a peer competitor.
Ajaz, for you to compare that with some of the other things, I think is just not accurate, but I'll leave that to your viewers to go ahead and take a look at that.
Okay.
Go back to your original question. Quite quite true, and I'm sure your other guests are aware of, but probably can't say, that outside analysts who are critical of China are not allowed to travel to China. The Chinese won't give them visas anymore. This includes a wide range of very responsible persons. Professor Perry Link, who has written some of the most enlightening articles and books and analysis of China over the last 30 years, hasn't been able to go to China for many years. The Chinese won't let people like me go into China because we are prepared to tell the truth. Those who go to China and who accept the Chinese largesse are restricted in what they say. And of course, when you ask them, they're not going to be able to say that. That's why I'm telling you and your viewers that that's the case.
Okay, let's get to our other guests here, starting with Adil Najam. Adil Najam, 2 points that I made with David Sedney and the points that he's making, I want your view on that.
So, just on the first thing for David, I live in the US, I work in the US and have for a very long time. I teach in the US, I write in the US, I speak in the US. And unlike David, I haven't lived in China, so I haven't been influenced in that sense. And nor am I a big fan of China. I'm not a big fan of any major power. I look at the world or try to look at the world from the eyes of the rest of the world. And in many ways, the rest of the world is worried about this saber rattling, about this search for an enemy that seems to be happening on both of those sides. Mr. Xi Jinping is not a hero in any of these ways. He's a strong man, an earlier strong man than Mr. Trump, and the U.S. democracy isn't what the U.S. democracy should be. So I think sort of the moment that the world has. And the type of, I think, sort of passion, if you will, to be charitable that David was employing is that there is serious concern, as you should expect, as a power that has not only been a major power now for a while, but especially since the fall of the Soviet Union had come to sort of fantasize as being the only power that will forever be this an end of history. Professor Fukuyama wouldn't call it in that sense, but that is the world order that is changing, and when the world order changes, you should never expect those powers that are going to be changed to be comfortable, nor should you expect the rising power to be comfortable. So both China and the US are very uncomfortable, and that's what makes the world uncomfortable. Because the world does want rules that it can prosper by rather than be imposed by rules that establish the hegemony of one or the other. And that's what this structuring is between the US and China. And this is not just, you don't have to sort of have to take sides. I mean, this is not just me. This is, for God's sake, Henry Kissinger. Right, another person who's not a fan of Mr. Chomsky, but nor is Mr. Chomsky a fan of him. But this is what he has been talking about for a long time. This is what my own one of my own teachers, Graham Allison, has been talking about. That's the inevitability here, that these are the cycles of history.
Absolutely. I mean, John Mearsheimer, Stephen Ward, you can name a number of, but very quickly, since I have to wrap up also, Adil, with reference to Indian occupied and annexed Kashmir, Genocide Watch had for 4 months straight India's occupation of Kashmir and its policies. It was top of the list on Genocide Watch. It's a matter of empirical record. I was talking about cherry picking that states do. I mean, I'm okay with it, but then one needs to, as I said to David, that's my point of view, that then the United States should say, well, okay, we're going to do this with reference to China because we are competition with China.
I'll be honest. I do not take the chest thumping on either side very seriously. Either side very seriously. You're exactly right. Sort of, one of the challenges for US is that it's more difficult at this point in time and in this time in technology to be able to assert we are the good guys, they are the bad guys, right? So that's the framework we've had, for example, from the Cold War and from most of these. And the reason for that partly is that it is difficult, it is not difficult to establish that China has problems. It is not difficult at all, because it is true. What is difficult to establish is that those problems are not on the US side either. Both behave as big powers do. And you're exactly right, whether it is policy on Kashmir, whether it is policy on Palestine, in China's case, whether it is policy on Muslims, in the US case, whether it is policy on Muslims. Right. There isn't the face with which that can be said. One sentence, if I might, because this was mentioned earlier, I do think it is about domestic policy. It is about domestic policy as it always is. In China also, but it is very much about domestic policy in the US, and that domestic policy is not just about finding an enemy. That domestic policy is also the state of US society and democracy we find ourselves. So Mr. Biden finds a very, very fragile, and I'm being charitable again in this word, very fragile society, very fragile democracy. Look at the last election, look at what's happening right now, and in that context, this comes. The difference is that unlike the Soviets that you could talk about as being far away, China is in everyone's home. It is the phone that I use here in
Absolutely.
Boston. It is in the apps that are on my computer. It is on every shelf on Walmart.
Well, that's precisely what the United States. Yeah, that's precisely what the United States is trying to get rid of. Let's see how that's going to work out. But as I said, I have to wrap up also. So back to Einar Tangen. Einar Tangen, you heard what David said, and also Adil Najam. So let's go ahead and get your view on this before I close the segment.
Okay, so, David has a point of view, but like a lot of points of view, he's not open to anybody else's. And I think this is an accurate reflection of the way a lot of people inside the Beltway, a lot of the elites are feeling, is that they're right, everyone's wrong, and they don't want you to talk to anybody. I mean, I raised a number of issues. He would have been free to, respond to those. That's why you have a dialogue. Instead, he wanted to attack me and the other learned guest. I don't know exactly why. This kind of paranoid fantasy that I can't say what I want is kind of nonsensical. I don't even really know him. So at this point, I would just kind of push that aside. In terms of where things are in cherry picking, yes. I think there is a credibility problem. Both at home and internationally, the U.S. has pursued policies that have resulted in a jumble. The inability to deal with important issues, especially social ones in the U.S., have led to massive polarization. And I think that has to stop. That has nothing to do with China. That's internal. Externally, this idea that we're always right, that hasn't worked out in Afghanistan, obviously. We're not pursuing a rules-based order. We are cherry-picking. So I would agree with what you said.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was David Sedney, Einar Tangen, Dr. Adil Najam for their insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the situation in Myanmar, where ousted State Councillor for Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, is facing trial. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Myanmar's ousted state councillor, which is equivalent to a prime minister, Aung San Suu Kyi, went on trial on Monday. She looked unwell, according to reports. Suu Kyi faces a slew of charges that everyone thinks are politically motivated. We're going to talk some about what the trial is all about. The other issue is deeply ironic. Last Thursday, a shadow government in Myanmar called on the Rohingya minority to help it overthrow the junta. Protests continue since the military coup on 1st February. The shadow government has also promised citizenship and repatriation for the persecuted Muslim community in a future democratic Myanmar. It is important to mention that the Rohingya have been persecuted for decades, and Suu Kyi herself came under severe criticism for her indifference to their plight. But let's get to our panel. For their expert views, I'm joined by Rubayat, Jasmin, researcher and doctoral candidate at Binghamton University, Maung, Zarni, human rights activist and fellow Genocide Documentation Center, Cambodia, and Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed, professor of international relations and director, Center for Genocide Studies, University of Dhaka. Thank you to all my panelists. Let me kick off with Professor Ahmed here. Professor Ahmed, as I said, it's deeply ironic. But it seems like, the coup obviously has been bad for Myanmar, but some good might come out of it as far as the Rohingya are concerned.
Well, thank you very much. Well, that depends. I think it's too early to say. The military is in power, or was always in power, actually. I don't think they left the power at all. I think whatever is going on is a kind of domestic, I would say, conflict between, the military and, of course, now with Aung San Suu Kyi's party. The point here is we tend to forget that military in Myanmar is not only a institution, a state institution, but also a political party. I think that's the difference between Aung San Suu Kyi's party and whatever the military is doing. So even if things changes, the military is not going to go away. The military as an institution will remain. It depends how they will reform themselves if there is any change in the future. As of now, as I said, it's too early to say. One good thing I think has come out of it, as I think the question that you're putting is the opposition is now almost tolerating, or would say accepting Rohingyas. It only shows that this was the whole issue that was made. The consensus that was earlier was absolutely, did not have a real basis. So now it's becoming very clear. But whether that will lead to a solution or not, I think it's too early.
Absolutely. With regards to what you have said, my point was, and I think you've corroborated that, I mean, there have been previous schools, there have been protests and the rest of it, but, the kind of reach out to the Rohingya that we've seen this time, we haven't witnessed before. And I also agree that the military in Myanmar is actually an armed political party. But I want to quickly get your view before I go to other guests. Do you see a difference, a qualitative difference in terms both of this anti-junta consensus across the board through various ethnicities, through various regions of Myanmar, and also a sense of a sort of will to reverse things? Do you think that there is a difference this time from the previous protests?
I'm not sure. As I said, it's too early because this is not the first time that Myanmar went through this cycle of violence and cycle of the opposition taking a different stand. Don't forget, earlier times the opposition even went for a violent insurgency kind of an issue. So I think it would be too early to say whether this would be a qualitative shift or not. I think what is happening this time is that it is now getting more projected around the world. But as I say, since when they were in power, they did not do anything. Aung San Suu Kyi went all the way to Hague to defend the military. I personally was also there in that room, and I saw how she defended the military, the atrocities that the military did in the Arakan. So coming from that point of view, now that they are in trouble, now that they are being cornered by the military, as I said, one has to wait and see how that evolves. But, frankly speaking, military is also an institution in Myanmar. It's not going to vanish anyway. You can reform it, you can change it, but I think that would require quite a revolution in Myanmar. Now, whether we are looking for a revolution in Myanmar or not, as I said, it's too early to say.
Right. Mr. Maung, Zarni, I want to get your view, on this issue of the reach out to the Rohingya, and also, some insights into this, the trial that has begun now. What do you say about this?
Yeah, let me first go to the fundamental question that you raised earlier about the military, because this is an extraordinary institution. We are not looking at, as Professor Imtiaz from Dhaka said, a domestic conflict. We're looking at an institution that is multiply accused of committing gravest crimes in international law, crimes against humanity. As we speak today, this is something that comes out of the UN High Commissioner's office. The High Commissioner herself has repeated that Myanmar military is committing crimes against humanity. And then the genocide against the Rohingya people, Bangladesh is on the receiving end of the impact of the crimes of deportation and other crimes against the Rohingya, and then war crimes against other non-Rohingya national minorities. So we're looking at a situation that has a very strong international legal and political implications and impact. So therefore, it's wrong to frame it as a domestic issue. Firstly, and secondly, I think the approach I would take is not episodic, what military did to or have done to the Rohingyas, or what the military is doing to the Burmese civil society that stands up against its terroristic methods to quell democratic dissent, and also the military coup. We need to take an institutional and integrated approach to understanding and framing this issue. And then this takes us to the Rohingya question. When Aung San Suu Kyi went to The Hague at the International Court of Justice, she wasn't actually defending the military. She was defending the state of Myanmar, because under the Genocide Convention, Myanmar was accused, or has been accused credibly, by the state of Gambia for having violated the terms of the international or interstate treaty called Genocide Convention. And by that, it means that the state of Myanmar, that includes the executive branch, judiciary, and the legislative branch, and then two of which Aung San Suu Kyi presided over. The legislative, definitely, and then the executive. And then she wasn't defending the military. She was defending actually the state of Myanmar, including her party at the time was the ruling party, 2016 and 17, when the crimes were committed. So the shift that that we are looking at today is the mainstream, particularly younger generations. The value transformation that has now come to accept Rohingya as our own people. And then finally, with respect to whether Rohingya will benefit or gain from this, the societal revolution, if you will, very much depends on whether national unity government, the parallel government formed by MP-elects and other representatives from a few different ethnic minority groups. It depends on whether NUG actually has control over territory and control of state institution. That I agree with Professor Imtiaz. It is still very early to gauge what actually Rohingya will gain. And then there is also a Rakhine element. Rakhine Buddhists have a very strong militant and militarized and armed movement, and they don't appear to be ready to accept Rohingya as equal and full citizens of Myanmar or Rakhine State. They are going for independence, unlike other ethnic communities.
Right. Before I go to Ms. Jasmin, I want to get your view also on the ethnic composition of the Myanmar military. And I ask this because, no matter how repressive a regime, it puts a lot of pressure on the people who are confronting their own people, shooting straight at them. A few weeks ago, there were reports of certain officers from the Myanmar military who had deserted, who were on the run, who were speaking to the media occasionally. So how exactly do you think the military rank and file is going to react to a prolonged sort of repression and killing of their own people?
I think this is the first time when we, the opposition or pro-democracy side, have seen a substantial number of, we're talking by the hundreds of the defection or desertion by both police and regular, armed forces personnel. And so, a lot of people have focused on the cohesion within the military leadership itself as a significant, the signal whether there will be some kind of, implosion that may create opening for the democratic opposition to take advantage of. But nonetheless, the morale of the Burmese armed forces has long been known to be extremely low, and obviously the military has been very effective in shielding its rank and file members from alternative interpretations of what's happening. And the military's official and institutionalized interpretation, which it shares with the rank and files widely and systematically, is that it is simply defending the state and defending the nation from disintegration and terrorists. Now the parallel government of Burma, National Unity Government, has been portrayed as a terrorist organization, and anyone associated with it is considered a treasonous individual. But the NUG and many of us have also pointed out the terroristic nature of the Burmese military. So what we have is essentially the national armed forces seen through the eyes of the Burmese public majority, different ethnic groups included here, as nothing but an armed gang of terrorists. And also, the fact is, the commander-in-chief, Maung, the coup leader, gave an interview to a television station about 2 weeks ago in Hong Kong that he was forced to admit that the military, however mighty and well-organized and well-armed it may be, is not in control of a large swath of Burma. The military has been unable to get a functional state up and running. There is no functional economy. So we have a situation where in the middle of Southeast Asia, we have a semi-Syria-like situation emerging. That is why this situation demands international attention.
That's something have been talking about. But before I wrap up, let me go to Rubayat, Jasmin here. Ms. Jasmin, I want to get your view on the trial as well as the Rohingya issue.
The trial, it just started, and to my opinion, it looks like another closed-door trial, which is staged in many repressive societies. So what would be the outcome is we are yet to see that. But the major concern is obviously is about the Rohingya issues. We all know that a repatriation discussion just started sometime last year, in a tripartite discussion, but it stopped. So the fate of this almost 1 million Rohingyas stranded in Bangladesh hangs in limbo right now.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Rubayat, Jasmin speaking with us. Thank you also to Professor Imtiaz, Ahmed, and Maung Zarni for their insights. This is all from In Focus this evening. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.